Welcome to the Criterion Chat, a podcast on cinema and the Criterion Collection. I'm Nate Myers, joined by Matt Peterson, as we discuss the Royal Tenenbaums in honor of its 20th anniversary. After garnering critical acclaim for their sophomore effort, Rushmore, director Wes Anderson and co-writer Owen Wilson collaborated with a cast of accomplished actors to make the Royal Tenenbaums, an eccentric comedy detailing the failures of a family of geniuses. Playing the family patriarch, Gene Hackman shines as Royal Tenenbaum, who upon learning of his estranged wife's plans to marry another man, concocts a scheme to enter once again into his family members' lives. Witty dialogue, inventive visuals, and highly mannered storytelling combine with an impressive collection of performances featuring work from Angelica Houston, Bill Murray, Owen Wilson, Gwyneth Paltrow, Ben Stiller, and Danny Glover, among many others. The Royal Tenenbaums stands as the first fully realized project from Wes Anderson, who has spent the subsequent 2 decades providing variations on its themes and style. Released by the Criterion Collection on DVD in 2002 and again on Blu-ray in 2012, the highly praised and much beloved film is presented to home theater enthusiasts with an impressive collection of supplements and strong visual and audio transfers. Join Matt and me as we hold up at 111 Archer Avenue. So Matt, we previously had talked about Wes Anderson's debut film, Bottle Rocket, a little while ago on this podcast, and I thought it was probably about time that we went and revisited some of his other work. He's very well represented in the collection. Nearly all of his films are in the collection. There's a couple that aren't yet in it, but pretty much everything he does gets into it eventually. But I thought this would be a good film to maybe revisit. As I said in my intro, it's the 20th anniversary of it this year, but I also think it's kind of an interesting film to think about now, because where we've seen his career go as a director and a writer since then, back when it came out, I think people responded to it a certain way, and now perhaps people look at it a little differently, having seen what he focused on as a filmmaker following upon this. So I'll just kick it over to you here, see just what your general thoughts are about this movie, and any ideas that you think maybe are worth exploring on it as we begin our discussion tonight.
Yeah, I think you made a good point in your intro there that this is really his first fully realized film stylistically, right? So, Bottle Rocket had very much kind of independent sort of flair to it. Rushmore really is kind of a hybrid of more traditional filmmaking in terms of its storytelling, but the Wes Anderson attributes or characteristics we've come to expect from him start to creep into that feature, right? But it's one thing I really like about Rushmore is it has that balance between the more whimsical elements and the elements that just feel more realistic and grounded. Whereas this film really kind of goes all in stylistically on the kinds of things we expect to see from a Wes Anderson film, right? And there's pros and cons to that. And, my opinion of this film has changed over the years. I did not really like this film the first time I saw it. And that may be sacrilegious to a lot of people. I know there's a lot of big Wes Anderson fans out there, and they kind of feel like he can do no wrong. And I think I was just kind of put off by the style initially. I felt that the eccentric qualities, kind of the preciousness of some of the moments in the film really overshadowed some of the emotional notes I was looking for. But I've grown to like the film a lot more in my most recent viewing here for our conversation. I think I appreciated it really in a new way. I haven't seen it for several years. I've got kids now. I've got, a family of my own. So there were things that I could relate to on a different level watching it again. And I still feel like the film kind of weakens toward the end, but really, really enjoyed it this time. And I think now that we're very intimately familiar with Wes Anderson as a director and his style, it is interesting to go back and kind of look at this film with fresh eyes in that way, because it's informed by the rest of his career. And his style really hasn't changed a whole lot from this picture, right? I mean, this really kind of cemented that visual style. We can kind of go into more details as we talk, but just initial impressions. Yeah, it's a very important film in his catalog for sure, and one that I've really grown to enjoy more over the years.
I've always liked this film, but I also think that in many ways it doesn't have the same kind of freshness to it that it had back when I first saw it in 2001. I remember going to see this in the theater with a very into it audience. The audience was very much into this movie as we watched it. You could feel the energy. You could feel them really laughing and enjoying it and clicking with it. And the sense of something new emerging here on the screen was very much there. That it's like, oh my gosh, this is this new director that we really haven't seen before. I mean, I think probably everybody in that theater had seen at least Rushmore, if not Bottle Rocket as well. But you got the sense of, man, this guy's got new things that he's doing, which is maybe a reflection perhaps more of our ignorance. I mean, he clearly is influenced by other people, Louis Malle especially. We have previously talked about the film Murmur of the Heart in this podcast. That's obviously a big influence here. But the fact is, I think that now if you look at it, you go, well, yeah, this is a Wes Anderson movie, right? I don't know that you felt like that quite the same way, or at least those words didn't mean the same thing back in 2001 that they mean now in 2021, because a lot of the way you use the word precious, Matt, the kind of just the slow motion shot to end a film, and the eccentric characters, the unique and bizarre costume design, the kind of impossible to place time of the setting of the story, right? Where it seems, gosh, it's set modern day, but all this technology and this dress seems to be from a generation ago. All of that's just been seen over and over and over again, that I think that now you can kind of look at it and go, well, yeah, that's just Wes Anderson. That's what he does. And he never maybe matured from this, or he didn't go anywhere with this. I think he does, especially in some of his more recent work of the past decade here, have some actual progression of his filmmaking and his interests. But at the same time, he really does create here the blueprint that has been his career over the past 2 decades. And this, I think, film nowadays, I could see how there's on one level of people that would look at it and say, wow, this is truly the pinnacle of Wes Anderson creating a new language or a new style or a new voice in cinema. And then others saying this is now kind of passé because we've had 2 decades of him and of spoofs of him and of ripoffs of people inspired by him, that this now doesn't seem to hold up. But for me, it still continues to work. I've always found it very funny. I've always loved the acting in it. And there's always things in it that I find so meaningful. It's a comedy, but boy, does it go into dark places. And it does play certain scenes. It has the smart sense of knowing what scenes, I guess, to play smartly and soberly and dramatically. And where to also punch up the dialogue and have some real humor and have some eccentricities that seem to work. I think it blends all those different emotional beats quite nicely and effectively. So that's, I think, one of the things that perhaps we can really delve into is, why does this film, and maybe, Matt, you don't necessarily agree with me on this, but it seems to me that this film really can achieve a certain kind of sophistication of emotional resonance that other films do not, right? I think you can really relate to these characters, particularly the children of Royal, that you can really relate to their plight in a very meaningful way, and at the same time laugh along with it as you recognize the great pain that's taking place within them. And I'm just curious to how do you think that works, or how it is that is achieved in this film?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, it's tough to entirely decode that, I guess. I look at this and see, like you said, a really effective balancing of all those elements, right? I mean, it's pretty easy for the style to really overwhelm everything here. And I do feel like that does happen in some of Wes Anderson's films, right? And like I kind of mentioned earlier, it can be tough to really push that aside and not see that as a distraction and focus on the dramatic elements or on the characters and the performances. But when everything is so overtly stylized, it creates really an otherworldly quality that I think can actually end up distancing the audience. But, that being said, this still is surprisingly effective at delivering those emotional moments that you want. I think ultimately it comes down to how this film and how Wes Anderson in general treats just the theme of childhood, right? What it means to be a child, what it means to learn and explore and to dream about being an adult. And I think Anderson understands that there's a certain level of inevitable disappointment with growing up, right? Being a child just has so much promise, and his films always have kind of that whimsical, childlike quality to them, and this film is no exception. And it's especially overt here because it's a family of geniuses, essentially, right? Or at least child geniuses. So these were all prodigies in one way or another. We had, a playwright, a tennis prodigy. Every child kind of had their own abilities that were nurtured by their mother more than by Royal. And there's the film, I think, has a lot to say about parenting in that regard. But ultimately, it all kind of leads to disappointment, right? So there's this kind of this idea of broken promises or wasted potential. And potential is one of those things that is tough because we never really know what the limits of potential are, right? I mean, potential is by its nature limitless. And ultimately, you may be setting yourself up for disappointment when you actually realize that. And I think this film really encapsulates all those feelings about childhood, about growing up. And that's something that, I think all people can relate to on some level. So those themes, I think, are very central here and are some of the most relatable themes I think you can explore. But also just the idea of a dysfunctional family. I think everybody has at least one or two members of their family that seem like you don't quite know what to do with them, right? And this film captures that too. So I think, it ultimately comes down to just themes of childhood, themes of dysfunctional family relationships. So even though you have this heavily stylized, heavily almost, fantasy-like world, like you said, we don't really know what time period this is, and it's intentionally kind of vague. You still have those universal themes that deliver. And it's funny when it needs to be, but Wes Anderson understands what scenes and what moments need to be played straight. And that can be a tough balance, and he has a real talent of finding that balance.
Well, I want to hone in a little bit on the idea that you hinted at there and kind of touched upon in the sense of the style being, I think, actually a very good way. It does distance us in a certain sense, but I think that distance that the style creates and the fact that we're so aware of the mannerisms, the camera movements by Robert Yeoman and his cinematography are very, very elaborate. I mean, I'm thinking in particular of that long shot at the end of the film where it just keeps crane kind of sliding along from one person, that great crane shot there, and it's all in one take. It's very obvious, and you kind of feel it. But just the way they compose shots, the way they frame shots, is very obviously cinematic, right? You're very aware that you're watching somebody who's, as a director, is showing off, as a cinematographer is showing off. The production design by David Wasco is, I think, extremely elaborate and heightened. Same with the costumes. I love the costume design in this film. Karen Patch is the costume designer. I think does a great job. And just the way these characters keep wearing the costumes in different settings, almost like The Simpsons do. It's kind of an interesting little parallel there. But I think all of those things combine together to actually make you connect with the themes and the emotions of the characters much more easily. If this was done in a straight dramatic way as a dysfunctional family, it'd be, I think, extremely painful for some people to watch because, like you said, we all have something of this in our family. Maybe there's some alcoholism, maybe there's narcissism, neglect from a parent or sibling rivalries, different things like that that can really kind of tear families apart. And when you see it thrown up there on the screen for you, it can sometimes be so painful. You go, oh gosh, no, I can't deal with that. And there's no catharsis almost because it's just too immediate to you. I think this film, because it's a comedy and because it's so highly mannered, you can relate to it, and you can also have enough distance to kind of say, well, yeah, but my family isn't this. They're not these geniuses, like where it was a prodigy business kid, a prodigy tennis player, a prodigy playwright, and then also a very accomplished litigator who then winds up losing everything because his son sues him, right? It's all these things that it shows in this very elaborate, over-the-top way that I think we kind of connect with because we know the dynamics of the human element.
Yeah.
But we don't have, or at least most of us won't have an experience of this kind of world. It's interesting because it's set in New York, although they don't ever say it's New York, and they actually specifically don't show the typical New York locations. I'm not a big. I don't have an intricate knowledge of New York City, so I don't know, this neighborhood, that neighborhood, or anything like that. But it's New York. But, I'm just thinking about the scene when Pagoda and Royal are talking for the very first time, and Royal learns that his wife, Ethel, is going to go ahead and get married to Danny Glover's Mr. Sherman. You have it set where you normally would have the Statue of Liberty in the background. They specifically frame Pagoda to be standing in front of the Statue of Liberty so you don't see it. And so it's just this kind of fairy tale like structure to the story or to the style that I think allows you to access the complex emotions in a way that brings humor, can even bring some sadness. I mean, there's some truly touching, heartfelt moments in this that, as I watch it, I can kind of feel my emotions actually being stirred. Particularly the resolution that comes towards the end when you see how the characters work out some of their issues and certain relationships are mended, or at least they progress on some level. There's some real emotional touches that take place there that I think also can be accepted because it is so stylized. I think the style in this case does not work against the film, but rather works for it.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, it does enhance it, in kind of a fairy tale sort of way. There's a real literary quality to the film, right? I mean, the film is kind of framed by these fictional, book chapters as kind of just indicating the different chapters of the film. So there's definitely a storybook quality here that I think, creates an interesting effect for sure. So it's kind of tough because I really have gone back and forth when it comes to Wes Anderson a lot of times. I mean, overall, I enjoy his films. I mean, I think he's a creative.
I think a lot of people have done that.
Yeah,
though. Just sorry to interrupt, but I think that there's been a kind of a yin-yang reaction to him. I mean, there's the diehard I'm all in, and then there's the diehard he's a complete total hack. But I think a lot of people have this sort of seesaw kind of reaction to him, like you're describing.
Yeah, and it's weird because when I watch his films, I mean, he's clearly a creative genius, right? I mean, insofar as he's established this very distinctive, effective world that has its own kind of flavor of humor to it that I really enjoy. But there are times where my brain almost gets confused because part of my brain is really enjoying it and really liking it, and the other part of it is saying, when are we going to get something new? Let's expand our horizons a little bit stylistically, or this is just too pretentious. This is too precious. This is too stylized, too mannered. It's just a little too cute, right? There are times where I almost have this aversion to his films. So it's a very kind of confused reaction at times. But I think when I sit down to watch a Wes Anderson film, I kind of have to turn off the cynicism, that may have developed my withered heartstrings, you know, the few that remain. I think I have to just embrace those whimsical qualities and kind of look at this like a child would in some ways, to really just enjoy the style, enjoy the world that he's creating, and just kind of go with it. And so you have to be in the right mood, or at least I have to be in the right mood, I think, to sit down and watch one of his films. But he is one of the few directors working that, you know, I'll see anything he puts out. You know, I feel like I know what I'm going to be getting, and part of me is hoping to be surprised that he does something different. But his upcoming film, The French Dispatch, I mean, from the trailers, it looks like more of the same, right? But I still want to see it, but the mood has to be right. I have to be in the right frame of mind to enjoy it.
Interesting, because I definitely can see your point, but I also feel like whenever I watch one of his movies, I'm in.
Yeah.
I don't feel like I need to really get myself in the mood. I mean, it's true that I don't just always pick out a Wes Anderson film on a weekend to watch, but if I did, I've never found myself going, boy, I wish I hadn't chosen this, right? Or I guess I wasn't in the mood for it. I didn't like it when I watched it just now. But this film in particular, I've always had a pretty strong reaction to it. I think part of that comes down to the performances, and maybe it's worth our getting into some of the acting here, because I think of all the different movies Wes Anderson has made, this is the one where the cast is really just exceptional. He gets, I mean, I don't want to criticize the work in the other performances of his films, because there's a lot of good work in a lot of his movies, but this one, really, it is. I can't think of, in the main cast of characters, anything that seems to be misplaced. They're all extremely good.
Yeah.
And this is probably the most, this is like Gene Hackman. It technically was not his last film, but boy, you wish it had been, because this would be a great swan song for his acting career.
Yeah.
To go out as Royal Tenenbaum. I think this is one of Hackman's best performances, because he really does this impressively. He's given a character. And Wes Anderson's been very obvious, or been very open, that this was written for Gene Hackman. He never really thought of anybody else, and it was, I guess, quite a heroic effort to get Hackman to take the part. That he didn't really want to do it.
Yeah.
Wasn't interested in acting anymore. Really hates it when people just write parts for him. Kind of a, who the hell are you to write a part for me? How do you know me enough to write a part for me? Which I have to say, as an actor, that probably would be pretty annoying.
Yeah.
To have somebody say, "Hey, I know you so well, I can just write this part for you," right? Anyways, but I think he's given a character that's, I mean, Royal is clearly a narcissist.
Yeah.
Clearly lived a terrible life. I mean, just really terrible. And Hackman manages to make this character relatable and likable. I still think of that scene. It's very early in the film where you're getting sort of the backstory of the family, and he goes to Margot's play, and they ask him, "What do you think of the play?" And he does the thing no adult ever does. He gives an honest answer. You know, and
that's one of the funniest scenes in the movie.
It is, and I pull that up for myself sometimes, because I'm in a position where I wind up having to go see different kids' plays and things like that for schools, and they're always just objectively awful. I mean, there's no other way around it. Like, that's like, yeah, the kid doesn't know how to act, or their singing's off, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And they hear someone just say, "Well, what story? It's just a bunch of kids in animal costumes." It just like, preach it, brother, preach it, you know. But he has a way of doing that where you can kind of go, yeah, that's right, that is what I want to say. I just happen to have the human decency to know you don't say that to an 8-year-old, you know?
Exactly.
And I just think that it's an incredible feat of a performance to take a character that on paper, and like if you just think objectively, if I knew Royal in life, I would absolutely despise this man. And yet I'm rooting for him, even though he's conning his family, pretending he's dying of cancer when he's not, for no good reason, is trying to obstruct his, I guess we can't say ex-wife, but his estranged wife from marrying another man that, from all we could tell, would make her happy, and complicates the people's lives, and yet at the same time, also as you see, as he finally seems to embrace the role of being a father, actually has good insights for each of his kids. About what they need to do and about the things they need to change in themselves. It's just an incredibly rich performance, an incredibly richly written character. And I just think he's fantastic, and he's clearly a huge reason why this film succeeds.
Yeah, he's great. I mean, we've sung the praises of Gene Hackman before. Our conversation on The French Connection, comes to mind. And
available on YouTube for anybody who is wanting to see it.
Yeah, that's right. So we did a deep focus episode on that film, and I'll repeat one of the points I made in that discussion is that Hackman, he really should be on the short list of the greatest actors of all time, right? And I feel like he gets overlooked so much, and it's just because he's so good that you don't even realize that he's acting, right? He just seems like that person. He just seems like that character, whether he's in, Unforgiven or Crimson Tide or this film or, French Connection. You just fully buy into whoever he's playing, and it just seems so effortless for him. And this film is no exception. He's outstanding here. But yeah, it's a great accomplishment that he creates a sympathetic character who on paper, should just be someone that is completely unsympathetic, that we would just despise. You realize this man should not have children, right? He's just incapable of being a proper father figure. But as you said, he does, when the moment really comes, provide advice, and he does love his children, but his narcissism is so strong that you could just get the sense that he's incapable of perceiving human emotion in a normal way, right? I think of that scene at the cemetery too with Chaz, where he says to Chaz, like, oh, there's another body buried around here somewhere, right? And then he takes half of the flowers that he took for his own mother and gives them to Chaz for the grave of his recently deceased wife. And it's just this, I mean, it would have been better for him, like, not to give any flowers, right? I mean, just the insensitivity and crudeness of that moment is so overbearing, but you can't help but laugh because it's such a darkly comedic, absurd moment. And the way he delivers it is so perfect. That,
right, because
in
he
his
delivers
mind,
it, like it's like
in his mind,
that's right, I'm helping you out.
Yeah, in his mind, he's being considerate, right? Like he thinks he's doing the right thing and caring for his son by doing this, and it's anything but. And that's kind of his character. He's just so tone deaf, generally speaking. I mean, there's some sociopathic qualities there too. I just think as a person, he doesn't understand how he's hurting people a lot of times. But at one point, he admits, he knows that he's a terrible person and that he's made a lot of mistakes and wasted a lot of time. So there is a sense of self-awareness there. But I think his narcissism and his ego tends to just overshadow that. But we do see a fairly decent arc from him in this film, right? And by the end of the film, he does seem very, very changed, or at least wanting to change.
And one of the things they do well to really, I think, hit that arc is the fact that they build it through a few different steps. Oftentimes what movies do is, and this is where usually those arcs feel false, is they set them up one way, they show them this way, and then all of a sudden when the story needs them to, they all of a sudden become something else. Just at the critical moment or at the very end or whatever. But you can see, take that relationship between Royal and Chaz, there's a few different steps there. And, of course, Ben Stiller plays Chaz and probably was, there more as the big star. He was a very comedic actor at the time, and a lot of people really liked. I mean, this is the same year Zoolander comes out, right? So he's very popular with a lot of these comedies. And here he plays a much darker and more damaged character than what people probably had been expecting from Ben Stiller based on his other work of that era. And I think that the two of them have this really wonderful development of the relationship where if you look at this, you're totally on Chaz's side, right? The flashback with him shooting with the BB gun as a kid, the fact that he steals all the money from Chaz when he's a child. So you're like, yeah, Chaz has every right to hate his father, has every right to not trust his father, every right to just get out of here, go ahead and die. And yet, the way that Hackman plays it, you kind of go, well, Chaz, come on, try to figure out what's going on with him. And the way Royal starts in that such a insensitive spot where he's just trying to con them and let's go to my mother's grave. I don't seem to have any sense of the fact that, oh, that's right, you would be mourning and really feeling great sorrow for your wife's loss. And yet he expresses it in that moment, like you said, where it's so inconsiderate, but he can't see how inconsiderate it is. But then you all of a sudden set up a little later on where he tries to get them to go to the grave again. And they're at that point saying no, and they've just have had enough of them. They figured out he's lied about the cancer. But you see, where does he go to the grave? He goes to Chaz's wife's grave. He doesn't go to his mom's grave, right?
Yeah.
You just have those little things that step it up throughout it so that it gets that moment where Chaz and Royal at the end can talk to each other and say, it's been a hard year. And he says to Chaz, I know. And you believe that he actually really truly does know what Chaz has experienced and the hardness of it, and that he cares about it. And that's an impressive thing that is set up not only through the performances, but I also think through the writing and just having those little small moments that allow it to be. Even just the little argument they have when Chaz and Royal go into the closet after Royal takes his grandsons to the dogfight and seems to think that the fact that it's dog blood on his son is okay because it's not actually his son's blood. But I love that, the fact that he kind of says, oh, no, it's dog's blood, like as if that's going to just explain this away and have it be okay. But the fact that he says in that moment, like, I don't think you've gotten over Rachel's death, right? I think you're having a nervous breakdown. It's like, he's correct. He correctly understands what's going on with Chaz, and nobody else in the family seems to recognize or understand that's what's happening to Chaz. He understands what's going on with Margot, right? That she's completely unfair and unfaithful to her husband, and she's treating him poorly, right? He understands what's going on with Richie. So he has this weird way of understanding things, but having no idea how to communicate his understanding of things. But that's the cool growth that he takes as a character, is he learns to actually communicate what he understands about another person and to kind of get over himself. And that's a really kind of thrilling thing to see in a movie.
Yeah, I mean, you could almost say, like you had mentioned during the scene where he sees Margot's play when she's a child. I mean, you could say that he's the most honest of any member of the family in many ways, and he's kind of the one without any filter, right? He's brutally honest, really at all the wrong moments, and that's not very conducive to great relationships a lot of times. But he does have a knack for telling people what they don't want to hear, and we mentioned the relationship with Chaz, and I think it's important to mention too that Chaz is with him in the ambulance during his heart attack when he passes away, right? So after all that, they share that moment, which is a pretty powerful moment in the film. But we should probably get into some of the supporting characters here too. You mentioned, I mean, it's just a really strong cast all around. I do want to mention Bill Murray in this. He has a very small role, but I do find some of his bits as like the funniest bits in the film. There's a lot of tremendously funny book covers that get shown throughout the film, and some of Bill Murray's characters' books are no exception. So he plays Raleigh St. Clair, I think is his name, right?
Yep. Yeah, based on, I don't remember the name of the real psychologist, but it's based on the guy, or inspired by the guy that the movie Awakenings, the psychologist in Awakenings.
That's right. Okay,
that Robin Williams plays. It's based on that guy.
Okay. But that scene where he's doing the examination of that boy, and wanting him to reassemble those blocks, is so funny to me. I think I get that gets the biggest laugh out of me, probably in the whole film, to be honest. It's just, I don't know what it is about that scene. Just his reaction is hilarious. But we should probably talk about the other kids too. Like you said, they're all really strong, and both the Wilson brothers are here again. And we should mention that Owen Wilson co-wrote this. I think people forget a lot that he has done a lot of writing with Wes Anderson. And
right, they're big collaborators at the start of their careers.
Yeah, and he plays Eli Cash here, who's this degenerate drug addict that's involved with Margot, and he has one of the most bizarre apartments I think I've ever seen. Those paintings really creep me out. His apartment, I don't know what's going on in those paintings with those bizarre people in like men in masks beating each other up or something. And he and his brother, of course, Luke Wilson, is in the film as well, playing one of the other Tenenbaum brothers. And they have an interesting relationship because, of course, they're fighting over Margot. And Margot is the adopted daughter, played by Gwyneth Paltrow. And there's a very interesting dynamic between the three of them that takes an almost tragic turn as the film progresses, with the attempted suicide of Luke Wilson's character. And his, you mentioned the costume design too. The costumes really inform the performances here a lot. I think it's worth mentioning that, with Luke Wilson in particular, always wearing the tennis gear. We're always reminded of his failure as a tennis professional. But any other performances that stand out to you? I mean, there's just so much to talk about. It's hard to focus in on any one thing.
Yeah, well, I think everybody's strong and everybody's very good. Bill Murray is one of those guys that you kind of go, my goodness, on one level you go, this character seems too small for him because of how much he does with it, and yet at the same time it's got a good amount of material and screen time and presence, but you kind of go, boy, it's Bill Murray. I'd love to see more of this, right? I'd love to see a movie about Raleigh St. Clair. I think it's worth really delving into that relationship between Margot and Richie. As Chaz, obviously, all three of the kids are shown to have had this sort of, they peaked early, right? Their success is behind them, and yet they're all very young. They're about 30 years old. And so it's a kind of it's a film about a failure. I mean, a family that failed despite all of its promise. And I think particularly the two of them, Margot and Richie, are really strongly showing that reality. Part of it is through the costumes, like you said. If you're paying attention, you recognize they're wearing the stuff they wore as kids. Gwyneth Paltrow as an adult is wearing the same coat that we see the young Margot wearing when she's young. Luke Wilson as Richie is wearing the tennis gear that he would have been wearing as a kid, and has even the same kind of hairstyle, right? So you see all these things that really do reflect the sense of a stunted maturing to take place there. But I think that both Margot and Richie, as they're portrayed through Gwyneth Paltrow and Luke Wilson, really do have this under the surface fragility. They just are so easily, you could see how their life could blow up and be destroyed. Ben Stiller's a little bit that more volatile character, blowing up, yelling, angry. That's his way of handling the grief and the disappointment of everything. Whereas Margot and Richie are repressed. And you can see how it boils up and how they're just feeling such loss. And, of course, the awkwardness of the relationship that Richie loves Margot, and it can never really be. But, the fact that they both come to realize, yes, they do love each other, and yet it can't happen the way that they would want it to. And learning to deal with that and to come to terms with that instead of just keep repressing that, right? It's a very fascinating portrayal, I think, of that dynamic that takes place between the two characters there. So I really like their performances. I especially like Gwyneth Paltrow as Margot. I'm not a big Gwyneth Paltrow fan, but this performance of hers, I really, really think stands as perhaps her best work.
Yeah, it's really good. I mean, Anderson is a big fan of the theme of unrequited love, right? I mean, we saw that in Rushmore too, with Jason Schwartzman's character and his teacher, and just this idea of whether it be infatuation or lust or even true love, just how that's doomed to failure frequently in life. And, you know, timing is a big factor in love, and the fact that, you know, two people may be perfect for each other, but if their paths don't intersect at exactly the right moment, that relationship is likely never to mature or take place. And I think this film gets to the heart of that too, because Richie and Margot, yeah, I mean, their admission of love to each other just comes too late, right? There's just too much water under the bridge. There's too much life experience, too much pain they've gone through to really make that relationship work, even though they're still relatively young technically. But there's this slightly taboo quality to it as well, even though Margot is adopted. There's still kind of that tinge of, well, this probably isn't a good idea, even though we're not related by blood. So that tragic quality is something I think Wes Anderson revels in his stories. You get that, some element of that, I feel like, in almost all of his films. But yeah, their performances are great, and they have, their performances are so muted, right? I mean, it's almost a very blank sort of tableau in terms of just their facial expressions and how they deliver their lines. But at the same time, you're still able to pick up on their emotions, and they're able to convey emotions properly and effectively. And it's very much a mannered Wes Anderson world type, performance and character that we see from both of them. But they still are able to make those emotional notes very resonant. So, yeah, like Gene Hackman, these are characters that on paper don't seem like they would be very likable. Margot in particular clearly has, made some questionable choices throughout her life in terms of, the number of relationships she's had and cheating on her husband, etc. But you still feel sympathy for her, and you still feel that these are people just looking for connection, and they've kind of become broken under the burden of being a prodigy, right? Being, someone that is expected to do great things throughout their entire life. And that's a big burden. If you have a lot of talents or a lot of abilities, it can really break someone to have almost too much potential. So it's an interesting cast, and I kind of had forgotten how early in Wes Anderson's career this film was, right? I mean, this is his third feature, like you had mentioned, and the fact that these elements are as mature as they are at this point is interesting. I mean, it's quite a leap from Rushmore to this film when you compare the two.
It is, and yet it also seems like the natural follow-up to Rushmore.
Yeah. Rushmore, I mean, definitely, like I had mentioned, it has those elements, right? It has those little montage bits with the on-text or the on-screen text that we see here, too. So those elements definitely were creeping into Rushmore, and here they are just in full force.
Right. And I think, you can definitely see just the influences of the French New Wave on Anderson as a director here, and just how much that really meant to him as a film buff, right? And somebody he wanted to capture that. I think the other thing that's worth talking about here is the way that the film uses music. And obviously a lot of people have talked about the soundtrack. It's very famous and a very kind of, I guess, a star-studded soundtrack. There's Rolling Stones music, Paul Simon, but also very famously the These Days by Nico. That particular version of These Days is used to great effect here in that introductory shot of Margot as she's coming off the bus to meet Richie. So I mean, there's just really solid, strong audio with it. But I think the other thing that sometimes gets lost in that conversation is Mark Mothersbaugh's score, which is a really good score and very effective. I think of particularly the canon that he created for the scene when they go to the cemetery, and just how much that captures the emotions of the characters and really brings you into understanding the dynamics that have been at work, but also in a way that doesn't betray the comedy. It's not an easy score to write. I can't imagine this was a very complicated score to figure out how to get it right, but I think Mark Mothersbaugh does a great job with what he offers on screen here.
Yeah, for sure. And his other scores for other Anderson films have been really strong too. And he definitely gets overlooked because you always think about the source music, and Anderson does a great job of choosing the tracks. And that is one thing about this film I think is a bit weak, is the second half of the film I feel like has too many little musical interludes, and it does lose a little steam for me, but it's still really effective, and I enjoy the choices of music. I mean, you mentioned the moment of Margot coming off the bus. That's probably the most famous moment in the entire film in terms of what people remember a lot, just the use of slow motion, and it's pretty impactful. It's such a simple thing, right? I mean, there's not many shots there, but that piece of music is just perfect, and it really kind of creates that sort of extrasensory quality of that moment in a unique way. So, yeah, very very well known for his use of music, and this is no exception.
Well, Matt, let's talk a little bit because we when he did the Bottle Rocket podcast, we had a couple of just little things because we know that Wes Anderson's very precious, as you said, and very particular as a filmmaker. So I guess I wanted to hit a couple of questions for you. As we know, Wes Anderson has kind of, in addition to sort of his big collaborators like a Bill Murray that keeps coming back time and again, there's other collaborators that he has that maybe aren't as well known. And so a couple of those people are in this film. Seymour Cassel is in this, playing Dusty, and has appeared in a lot of his other works. He was the dad in Rushmore. Kumar Pallana is in this. He plays Pagoda. And so I'm just curious, of those little kind of, shall we call the stock company of Wes Anderson's films, who is the person that you kind of always, like, when you see them in the movie, you go, oh, good, this is going to be fun. He's going to have just a fun little line, or he's going to have a fun little part. What's the character that kind of, in those Wes Anderson films, you find most kind of you're looking forward to having incorporated into the movie?
Well, when Bill Murray is not the star, I always look for Bill Murray. Like, what is he going to do this time? But definitely the actor that plays Pagoda, I would say. And what was his name again? I should know his name.
Kumar Pallana.
Yeah, he's great. He always makes me laugh whenever he shows up. He has a presence that's just so like Wes Anderson, right? He's just this kind of fixture, and his line deliveries too sometimes are just hilarious. But I would definitely say him.
Yeah, no, I adore him in this. This is his best his best hour in the Wes Anderson movies is Pagoda in this. Where just the way he kind of keeps looking around and like noticing how people are running away. Like, there he goes. It's just when he's like Royal's running away.
Yeah, he's like Royal's spy too,
Well, the fact that you learned that when he was a hired assassin that tried to kill Royal and then carried Royal to a hospital.
But when he stabs him again too, like he takes out that tiny little Swiss Army knife, it's like the tiniest little blade and just goes right at him, and then immediately tries to help him again. Just very, very memorable. So I really enjoy it every time he pops up.
All right, and then the other question I have for you, of the various behind-the-scenes collaborators, so like this time we have obviously Robert Yeoman as the cinematographer, Mark Mothersbaugh as a composer, but obviously there's like Alexandre Desplat is used by Anderson now for his scores and things like that. Of those various collaborators that help make this unique style, who's the one you think deserves the most credit for helping Wes Anderson make a Wes Anderson movie?
Oh, boy. That's tough. I mean, you probably have to go with Robert Yeoman, the cinematographer. I mean, the visuals are so distinct here, and just the lens choices. I mean, the use of the anamorphic in this film is just great. I mean, we probably should mention that. Just the way characters are placed and the whole frame is used.
Composing,
the frame
composing shots. How
exactly.
Camera.
Just with camera movement. I think of that little scene on the bridge between Margot and Eli when they're breaking up. It starts as kind of this two shot where they're on opposite sides of the frame, and then it does some panning back and forth, and then it reframes with both of them kind of on one side. Then it pans up and zooms into that private investigator, that detective that's following them. Just a great, well executed piece of camera work there. So the use of symmetrical shots, right? So characters are central very frequently. There's some point of view shots that are interesting too. So I have to think that he's very instrumental in just creating the feel of a Wes Anderson film. But I do want to mention Mark Mothersbaugh again, because I really do think he gets overlooked. I mean, his score for Life Aquatic in particular, I think is amazing and really intricate, complex compositions that he comes up with for these films. And the quality of the music, the almost fetishistic nature of, the level of detail that we see visually is reflected in his score, the work that he's done for Wes Anderson. So there's a real kind of continuity there in terms of just delivering music with a level of complexity that meets the complexity we're seeing on screen. So hard to pick between one or the other, but probably the cinematographer more than anybody else.
See, I'm gonna go with Mark Mothersbaugh. Even though I wonder if he and Anderson must have had maybe a falling out, because they've not worked together now for several features. But
I don't know what happened there.
Yeah, I have no idea. But I think that the work he did does so much to really ground and tie together the various elements that we see visually. Sound oftentimes and scores oftentimes, I think, get kind of underappreciated and how much they shape a movie. But I think that his work really is key to establishing Wes Anderson in this part of his career. And even though they didn't continue, I still think that he really does help create the storytelling, the style, the structure, the confidence that Anderson needs to go on and do other things as well. So I definitely think he's the key collaborator for Anderson and making Wes Anderson be who he was or is as a director. I really do think that fans of Wes Anderson definitely should pay close heed to what Mark Mothersbaugh has done in these scores. Obviously, you highlight the intricacy of the work and just how complicated these scores are. They aren't simple little riffs, and they're unique, and yet they're very memorable. And one of the fun facts is that the sort of the theme in The Life Aquatic is part of the theme of Royal Tenenbaums played in reverse. So it's just a fun little thing that connects the work between the two movies there. A little cool fact there.
Didn't realize that.
So, well, maybe we could just turn our attention then, Matt, to the release by Criterion. This was originally released on DVD as a 2-disc set. And actually, I believe, was just one of the more mainstream releases from Criterion, because I believe it was the only way that the Royal Tenenbaums was released on DVD back in 2002 was the Criterion release. I don't think
it was always
separate.
the most common Criterion. I remember just seeing it everywhere. I know Best Buy, brick and mortar stores carried it. You could see it at Target. You saw it pop up at used places all the time. So, yeah, it was like definitely the most mainstream Criterion up to that point.
Yep, that and The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, I think, are the only two times that a movie's major disc release was put out through Criterion and not by some other studio first. So there was that, and then, of course, they did upgrade it 10 years later when they did the Blu-ray. I have the Blu-ray. It's just ported everything over from the DVD in terms of special features. Great release. I really like it. There's some cool artwork, of course, by Wes Anderson's brother. And then there's some good special features, a nice behind-the-scenes documentary, just going through the making of the film, the designing of the sets, as well as a good audio commentary by Wes Anderson. So it's a nice release. I'm just curious do you have any thoughts about the release from Criterion?
Yeah, it's great. I've got the Blu-ray as well, and I do want to make another mention of the artwork that all these releases seem to get from Eric Anderson. Really just a perfect complement to these films. Again, it has this childlike quality, even though it's really a well-done piece of art, but it still has this simplicity to it that does seem kind of like a child drew it, but that's not an insult by any means. It really is the perfect choice, especially for this film. But I didn't get a chance to get into the special features here recently. I had watched them in the past, but yeah, it's a great release, no question.
Well, then this brings us, Matt, to our final question of the night, which is, does the Royal Tenenbaums belong in the Criterion Collection?
Yeah, I would say yes. I mean, like I had mentioned before, this is a film that is very important in terms of Wes Anderson's career. It's really the first fully realized film in terms of the style that we've come to really expect and know from him. And I still think the film holds up really well. I mean, just it is really a very, very funny. The comedy still works beautifully, but as we've pointed out, it's also a very emotional film and has its dark moments. And it's something that I really enjoyed revisiting this time.
And I would agree. I think it definitely... Wes Anderson's a director that certainly, for his generation, is one of the most important directors. Like you said, he's one of the few directors, I think, along with, say, a Quentin Tarantino, that by him just being involved in a project attracts certain talent to it, attracts an audience. That's not very common these days, to be honest. And so for that reason alone, he's an important director. And this is one of his important films. You could argue that he's maybe overrepresented in the collection. But this movie, if you had to pick one, this is one definitely to put in there. And again, I think also just as a way of documenting the career of Gene Hackman as an important actor, this is one of his finest hours as a performer, and it also is a great late career performance from him. So I think it's worth it for keep preserving and showing his acting as well. So definitely belongs in the Criterion Collection. And thank you everybody for joining us. Please join us next month when we will be talking about John Frankenheimer's The Manchurian Candidate, which will be released in June. Thank you, and keep collecting.